Welcome in to the Hot Read Podcast live here on Tuesday, December the 17th. My name is JT Ruhnke, host of the Hot Read Podcast here, writer and reporter over at Broadway Sports Media. You can follow me over on Twitter at JT_Ruhnke. And once again, on a day where nothing happened, we're just gonna have a fun, light show where we talk about who did you say that you wanted to talk about? Jack
Nelson, the left tackle out of Wisconsin.
We're gonna talk a lot about Jack Nelson out of Wisconsin today, but the only person who knows more about Jack Nelson than maybe Jack Nelson himself is my co-host Stoney Keeley, editor-in-chief over at Sobros Network, one half of Football and Other F Words, and co-writer over at stackingtheinbox.com. Stoney, how are you doing on this fine Tuesday?
Man, I'm great. I'm a little stressed out because of day job stuff. We were kind of talking in our production meeting about stuff kind of wearing me a little thin right now. But I drowned out the noise Sunday night. My mentions were a disaster. I made a joke. I said, well, to be fair, people don't know it's a joke on Twitter, but yeah. I just said, hey, Will Levis completed 67% of his passes today. And people just did not want to hear it. Like, you can't even make jokes right now. I had people in my mentions calling for Callie's head all game long. I had people calling for Levis's head. Everything was doom and gloom. We got to fire everybody and start over. I don't agree with that. I got tired of reading it, so I just checked out. And you know what? I watched a little Jack Nelson tape. I watched some Charles Grant tape, the left tackle out of William and Mary, really fun prospect. I watched Die Hard for the first time. Had an impromptu date night with my wife. We never do that during the week. I went to an establishment that we don't give free advertising for on this show, and I had a little spiked apple cider. I've been living great this week, just kind of letting Titans fans be mad at the world right now. They're in hell, but I'm not going down with them. Okay.
I think that's a great place to be. Unfortunately,
hell,
we do. No, not there.
Oh, my bad.
Yourself.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was about to say, wait a second, JT. What kind of show is this going to be?
Drinking spiked, apple cider, watching Die Hard. That's a great place to be. But unfortunately, we have to go down to the depths here because obviously, Will Levis's time of death came at exactly, I believe, 1:17 today when Jeremy Fowler tweeted out the Tennessee Titans are planning to make a switch at quarterback this week, source told ESPN. Mason Rudolph is the logical candidate to step in for starter Will Levis because if he said Trevor Siemian, I would have lost everything.
I want some Trevor Siemian reps, though.
Who likely heads to the bench, barring surprise. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. We could have, if this news, hadn't dropped, if we got a different decision later in the week, obviously Brian Callahan said he was going to try to keep it as close to the vest as possible to give themselves some gamesmanship and maybe a strategical advantage. Of course, that did not happen by way of whoever decided to leak this today. But, we're here, we're in the here and now, and this is the decision that they're going with. And I'm certainly excited to talk about it with so many of you here in the comments. And if you are joining us live, which I see many of you are over on Twitter or Facebook and want to get into the conversation like Zach and Clouthouse and Eddie and Kenneth and all the fine folks over here on the YouTube, head on over to Broadway Sports Media or 440 Sports YouTube channels where you can join them. And we have a lot of guys fired up, especially my favorite comment, which, Daniel never disappoints here. And we got to start off the comment section today with Daniel's word of the day to describe what Titans fans are feeling, which is, drum roll, please, lament. It is time to lament, says Daniel, with his one word in the chat. And we do appreciate you being here. And what we also appreciate you doing is heading on over to our sponsor of this show, Sinkers Beverages and Bluegrass Beverages, especially on a day like today when many Titans fans probably need it. Might as well go get yourself some of the finest beer, wine, and spirits that Nashville has to offer over at Sinkers Beverages. More on them later. So much to discuss today, and so many people fired up. I know Kenneth says he's fired up and ticked off, JT. Hashtag Never Levis has been right all along, Stoney. Never doubt ourselves.
Listen, I I'm so thankful that Kenneth remembers hashtag never Levis. I don't feel like I can claim that because I bought into the Will Levis hype a little bit this offseason. And I thought with Brian Callahan, he was going to turn it around and I was going to be proven wrong. I should have stuck with my evaluation because the shit that I said about him at Kentucky is exactly what we're still talking about 2 years later. So I appreciate the homage there, Kenneth, but I can't, I did doubt myself for a little bit. And so I don't feel like I can victory lap on Never Levis now at this point.
Yeah. I mean, I was someone who kind of, the night that Will Levis was drafted, you and Easton, you took my place on the Hot Read podcast day 2 draft show as I went and watched the Mets and Braves play at Citi Field in New York City. And I remember watching you guys, watching the draft, and they picked Levis, and I was laughing to myself in the at Citi Field. And I think, was I ever in on Will Levis? No, but I think this experience has and will continue to teach us a lot of things. And maybe I was behind Levis at a lot of points, but I think that it was good to keep an open mind as the era most likely and all but certainly comes to a close here on Will Levis. And we are going to get into all of your wonderful comments here, like Cloudhouse saying time for slander, Zach saying finally ran the ball in the red zone, and that's when they knew Levis couldn't cut it. I'm not disagreeing with you, especially when they come out against the Bengals in this game and just kind of shove it down the Bengals' throat in the red zone and score 2 touchdowns. It kind of felt like Callahan at least learned from his lesson in trying to hand the ball to Will Levis and trusting him to go down there and convert. Certainly did not look good for him. And then, of course, what happened afterwards is what we are going to get into here today. A couple more comments before we continue. Eddie saying, let's get crazy. Joey saying, I don't want to be here anymore. This timeline sucks. Clout House saying, word of the day for him is vindication. Certainly it seems like.
Am I the only one here that's like happy that we're at this point? Like, I'm not happy that my favorite team only has 3 wins on the season, but like now we know this season was about getting the evaluation on Will Levis. We know what the answer is. Now I'm starting to get excited thinking about quarterback possibilities, doing the draft prep. I'm watching this team. This is going to get me in trouble. Okay. But transparency here, just being honest. I think there's plenty other things to be excited about with this Tennessee Titans team. I think they're getting better in a lot of areas that they were pretty bad at early on in the season. Like, I don't know, man. I feel like this thing is trending in the right direction aside from the quarterback position. And now we get to dissect who's going to be the next guy. I don't know. I'm kind of fun. I'm feeling it's pretty fun.
Yeah. I mean, hey, that's going to be great for us when we get to draft content. And boy, do we have some things in the works for you guys. I know we're going to get into everything that Titans fans don't want to hear, but you're going to want to see what we have in store for draft season because it's going to be something special this time around. Okay. Before we get into the debate on whether or not this was the correct decision for Brian Callahan to make the move, effectively making Mason Rudolph the starter for the rest of the season. Of course, he kind of leaves it door halfway open, saying that he is the starter for week 16. However, I feel like when you look at what happened in the Cincinnati Bengals game where he gets benched and then not going back to him, I can't see a world then after this week, even if Mason Rudolph were to, absolutely crap the bed. Like, I don't see a world where you can come back from this because we did talk to Will Levis after this game and we talked about how he's been in this situation before and it was a struggle for him to mentally pull out of that and kind of regain his confidence. And by benching him this week, I don't see a way that you could find Will Levis getting his confidence back for 2 games left in the season. But before we get into all of that, let's talk about the facts and why we came to this decision. We being the Titans and Brian
we made
Callahan.
This decision.
We did. Me and you. We made this decision. Me and you.
They're reading our tweets.
They are reading our tweets. But this is why Brian Callahan, I believe, made this decision. And it goes back to his press conference on Monday where, I think that he said some things in the press conference that I really do think kind of sealed Will Levis's fate early on, and why I really did believe it was going to be Mason Rudolph from the get-go. You talk about Brian Callahan saying, you try to do best by all players involved, and the guys getting ready to go play games on Sundays want to feel like we're going to put them in positions to win, Callahan said. I think that was the biggest thing. I think he was speaking very plainly about, what. Now, the thing is, does the quarterback position also subscribe to this kind of thought process, right? We've seen this happen a little bit earlier in the season, right? Brian Callahan noted that, we've seen it in the linebacking core, where, we've seen Jerome Baker not play a lot, as I hit my light off the stand. We've seen, Jamal Adams. Jamal Adams exited the team after, play just wasn't up to standard. Like, we've seen this happen. Jaquan Jackson getting demoted. But does it necessarily apply to the quarterback position? And I think that when you look at it and look at Levis's performance specifically over the last 2 weeks, I think you absolutely have to take that into account. We're still talking to these guys in the locker room after every loss at Nissan Stadium in a way. You still sense the frustration of guys who are, like Jeffrey Simmons started to allude to 2 weeks ago, putting their resume on tape, still going out there and trying to win for this team and for this coach and for the group of guys that are in that locker room. And when you have a guy like Will Levis, who is, effectively losing the Titans games early in the season and now late into the season, I think it's totally fair that you kind of keep them to the same standards, especially when you also have a guy in Brian Callahan, who is a first-time play caller and head coach, trying to put himself out there on tape, trying to prove his chops. And with Will Levis being the quarterback that he is currently in this state, I think it's frustrating for a guy like Brian Callahan to try to show the upper management in ownership that he can and he has the capability to call a competent offense. And it's really hard to do when you have Will Levis kind of being historically putting up a historically bad season. And why I say that is I go back to what Teron Davenport tweeted on Sunday when he said, per ESPN stats and info, Will Levis is the first player this season with multiple halves of 0 touchdown and 3+ turnover football. He initially did that in week 1 at Chicago and again today in the first half. Kirk Cousins and Mac Jones are the only other players with one such half this season. So there are 4 halves of football where there have been 0 touchdowns and 3+ turnovers, and Will Levis has half of them. My opinion, just does not fly and kind of goes into the decision for Brian Callahan here. So that's what I ask you, Stoney. Do you think that this decision should also affect the quarterback position, even though they do get treated a little differently, by the media, by teams, by even like players? Like it is an integral part of the position, but I think when you look at this team right now, they should be I mean, Will Levis should be kind of held to that same standard.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I agree with the sentiment of, considering all players in the locker room when making a decision of this magnitude. Though there is a voice in the back of my head that's like, man, I hope Jeffrey Simmons just walked up to Brian Callahan in the locker room and grabbed him by the shirt and said, enough with this. That's what I'm hoping happened. Not officially reporting that, obviously, but I'm hoping there's people are close to violence. That's how bad Will Levis has played. But in all seriousness, I think there is a culture aspect of this to consider as well. You talk about Brian Callahan being a first-year head coach and in terms of the tape and putting his good shit out there on tape to prove himself to ownership that he can do it. I think that stuff is already out there this season. I think the tape, as far as Brian Callahan's play design, has been pretty good. Can he improve as a play caller? Sure. The play sequencing, the situational football, that sort of thing. It's it's there. I get it. The complaint is there, but I'm not as concerned about it as other people. But I think the locker room aspect is where I would draw the attention to next, because he is a first year head coach. He is trying to establish his own sort of culture. And if he goes out, makes an example out of Jaquan Jackson, out of all the time, the rotating carousel at right tackle between NPF and John Ajuku and Leroy Watson. I don't even remember who all has played right tackle for the Titans right now off the top of my head. But if you're going to set that standard, Jerome Baker, you're out. If you're going to set that standard, I do think you have to send the message to the locker room that it's for everybody, and poor performance is not going to be tolerated. You set the expectations. People know what they need to do in order to have good standing with this coaching staff, and you clearly communicate. And I think those are the foundation of a good, strong bond, not just, and this isn't just football, but the transparency, the expectations, that sort of deal is good communication in any business, in any walk of life. And I think that's what Brian Callahan is trying to establish here. And I think it got to a point where Will Levis simply forced his hand. And he looked at it and he said, I am going to be, on one hand, I could be letting these guys down because I am making the decision to roll with Will Levis, despite the fact that he is costing the Tennessee Titans games. Or on the other hand, I could potentially lose the locker room if I'm benching everybody else, but Will Levis is on a different standard. And not just that quarterbacks are different than everybody else on the field, but this is catastrophically bad. This is not like a couple of subpar games. Oh, he threw an interception today. No, this dude had 4 turnovers on Sunday, and it was bad stuff. You have to stick with the consistent messaging, or else that's when you start seeing some cracks in the armor a little bit. So far, this group appears to be playing hard. They appear to be invested in games. I don't think that Brian Callahan has lost the locker room by any stretch of the imagination, but I think you've got to remain consistent. And just the bottom line, you've got to be a man of your word. If that's the example you're going to set, you got to stick to it.
Yeah, I agree. And you talk about how catastrophic it has been. It doesn't take a lot to see how bad this stretch has been after 4 games where you get, I believe, you got one win in that 4 game stretch where we thought Will Levis was really good, or one of those 2 like that, right? And so, even when he was playing good, it still was a challenge. But you look at what he's done over the whole, and you can go to one of our good friends, Zach Lyon, over at Cover 2 with Blaine and Zach on 104.5, and he put out a tweet earlier today before the firing where he said, these are the only quarterbacks with a negative adjusted EPA per play on the season, which was a minimum of 185 quarterback plays. You had Deshaun Watson at 39, Jacoby Brissett at 38, Will Levis 37, Cooper Rush 36, Bryce Young 35, Anthony Richardson 34, Gardner Minshew 33, Caleb Williams 32.
Bro.
Titans quarterback Mason Rudolph is plus 0.065 and comes in at 22nd in this stat. Levis is at minus 0.112 in terms of adjusted EPA per play on the season and on the year. And you talk about that kind of atrocious play that we've seen. You can go back to just what we've seen at the beginning of the season and at the end of at the end of Levis's time this season. You look at the last 2 weeks. We just talked about how historically bad it is to have 2 performances of 0 touchdowns and 3+ turnovers. That comes in the Cincinnati game. And then you look at Jacksonville, and it wasn't necessarily by way of turnover, but 2 blatantly missed touchdowns that costed that game for the Titans. Against Jacksonville, a team that they should have beaten. And you look at the first 3 weeks of the season for Will Levis, 5 interceptions, 2 of those returned for touchdowns, 3 losses, 2 one-score games. And so this is kind of where the data tells me that this is a coaching staff and this is a team that is just kind of fed up with and done with their evaluation of Will Levis, right? You talk about, and so I went through the first 3 games of the season for Will Levis and these last 2, and I looked at how many of Will Levis's turnovers on the ensuing drive by the other team after either forcing a fumble by Will Levis or picking Will Levis off, how many of those drives turned into points for the opposite team? You look at the Chicago game, 11 points directly off turnovers. They lose in a one-score game by 7. New York Jets, 7 points directly off of a Will Levis turnover. They lose by 7. Green Bay, he only gives up that one pick six that turned into points. They lose by 16. That was more of a team effort. So we can give Will Levis that one. And then you look at the last 2 games. Jacksonville, 14 points left on the board by Will Levis on those drives. They lose by 4. And Cincinnati, 24 points off of Will Levis turnovers. They lose by 10. There are 4 games in there where they are in the mix if Will Levis can kind of mitigate those turnovers. And you saw him kind of, at the beginning of the season start rough, kind of improve a little bit. But the nail in the coffin is he kind of reverted back to that form earlier in the season that is just not only backbreaking on Will himself, but the whole team and this coaching staff still trying to scratch and claw to get wins in this business. And so we're back to where we started with Levis. And I think that's a lot of what the situation was when making this decision.
Yeah. And I think Kenneth raises a good point in the chat as well. I think the bar was so low after those first few games from Will Levis that we were it was a little bit of fool's gold in that time period when we thought he was improving. And I felt like I was kind of on an island raising my hand quietly and saying, I don't know, guys, is he really improving enough to win the job, or are we just excited because it looks a lot better than it did to start the season? I think that's a valid point. I also think with Will Levis, and I'm going to start calling him Groundhog Day because I'm waking up and it's the same shit over and over. It is locking onto the first read. It is inaccurate placement of tight window throws. It is operating just like a shade behind everybody else, like hesitating a little bit and allowing cornerbacks to come back to the point of the catch and shut those passes down. It's the same stuff over and over. So at a certain point, it kind of feels like it's an inevitability that this is just who he is. And when you get to that moment, that's when you got to make the change. And for me, Sunday felt a lot like watching Marcus Mariota in that Broncos game, where you just kind of felt in your gut like, oh boy, it's over. It is so over. And Ryan Tannehill comes in and turns it around. I don't know who Ryan Tannehill is in the current situation that the Titans have on their hands, but I do think it's at a point where it just became inevitable.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think we've reached that boiling point. Let's get to some of these comments here because you guys are lighting them up here, and we appreciate you guys being part of the conversation. And if you are watching over on Twitter or Facebook and want to join said conversation, head on over to the Broadway Sports Media or 440 Sports YouTube channel where you can join the conversation like so many here. A lot of, earlier in the show, we had Eddie saying, we'll get to some options that the Titans could have for next year, but he says they should go poach Daniel Jones off the Vikings practice squad. That certainly would be an interesting development. And there are a lot of fans talking about how they want Levis today. We'll get into this, like talking about how they want this season to just be like chaotic bad towards the end of the season. That would be the most chaotic bad. Just bring Daniel Jones in for 3 games. Just see what he's got. Maybe we can do a mini version of let's see what this cat's got, like we did with the Levis experiment there. That would be crazy. Zach saying, me and my buddy were yelling at Bengals fans that Will Levis throws interceptions for free while they pay $275 million. Big brain play right there.
That's good. Well done.
Clout House also talking about what you said. The funniest thing about Levis is that nothing changed between training camp and today. He's the same quarterback he's always been. And we talk about early in the season how, we wonder if we looked at that Miami game and the Atlanta game last year and just wondered if those were the top moments and that they'd be so few and far between that that's just not the player that when coaches say, I can fix him, that's just not someone he ever will be. Kenneth also having some strong thoughts on Callahan putting Rudolph in. So we'll leave those to the debate portion here. Adam, coming back. Welcome back. He says, I miss data. That's a
Man,
mythical Hot Read podcast poll right there.
it
For
is. Yeah.
sure.
I'm sorry. I'm not living up to the standard.
Expectations. Yeah,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But Ed Henry saying, I have been a Levis supporter and I have officially raised the white flag. He needs a moment. A lot of therapeutic talk here as well. As Jake Robertson says, I feel like I'm stuck in a perpetual Ouroboros of hope, hurt, player acquisition cycle, drink. That's our first player acquisition cycle of the day. So that's good. We made it, 25 minutes into the show without saying it? We're getting better.
Yeah.
But
we are.
We're getting closer to said word that I'm not going to say. But, we still are getting better at not saying it. It's going to be okay, buddy. Jake, it's going to be okay. Time moves on, and so do we. It's definitely going to be okay here. As Joseph Allen also saying, this franchise is for the birds. Just failure from top down. We're a poverty franchise and a complete joke. And I would push back and say I still do think that there are a lot of good things going for this team. Have you heard of Jarvis Brownlee Jr., Tavondre Sweat, young guys who have been very, very good this season? Like, there are some things that, when you look at where the division is as a whole and look at where this team is, and as they continue to build, if Amy Adams-Strunk does let them continue to build, that being Rand Carthon and Brian Callahan, there, I saw earlier today just some stats on like total team EPA, offense and defense, and like the whole AFC South is just in like the bottom corner of like inefficient on both sides of the balls. And so like, it's not crazy to say, I think, that this, like, next year, the AFC South is just going to be as like bad as it has been in years past. And so like, there is opportunity for this team to get back to where they need to be quicker than people imagine. I think today just kind of amplifies, a waving of the white flag on the experiment that you've put now 2 years into. And like, I think for a lot of fans, you're just getting to the point now where it's, it's kind of like we wasted all this time just for this. And I think that's where a lot of it stems from. But, there's only so much that we can control here.
Listen, we still have each other too. We still have each other. Misery loves company. We're here to process and talk through the issues with this team. That's what we're here for. So the season may be over, but we still have our community, everybody. Let's just, lean on each other right now in this trying time. That's what we need to do.
That is M saying Aller in next year's draft is a future star. I hate to break it to you, but I hope you mean the 2026, because the Eddie's all in for Aller campaign that he's been running in our comment section is unfortunately over for what seems like the foreseeable future until we get there.
I also love that, like, a month ago, I was like, oh, I'm going to be really surprised if Drew Aller does not go back to college. And then when Drew Aller goes back to college, I'm just completely devastated anyway, even though I saw it coming, it's down bad.
Cloudhouse says you just need to go back to training camp. Levis was the third best quarterback, and just like him, the Titans jammed him in. Nothing in his play evolved, and he's injury prone. I do think that is it fair to say that maybe the only place that Will Levis has progressed in his like career as a professional football player is that he's learned to protect himself a lot better? And even then, it feels like there's still some moments that kind of you take a deep breath in and you're kind of surprised by, but like, it's still like saying that we've gone through this entire progression of Will Levis, and the best and most positive thing we can say is that he's no longer just throwing his body into defenders trying to like get somewhere. And I think that's where we are right now. Ed also saying, tell me we are not looking at a middling quarterback that gets us 7 to 8 wins. That's my biggest worry at this point. You and I think everyone else that wants to be here. And so here's where we are right now, right? For me personally, I don't know about you, Stoney, but I agree with Callahan's ultimate decision to roll with Rudolph here.
Yeah.
You look at the last 2 weeks, and it's been some of his worst football. I really do think that, the thing that we don't know behind the scenes is how much, is riding on these last 3 games in a dynamic between Amy Adams-Strunk and this front office and the coaching staff. Like that,
Sure.
I think, is the biggest unknown right now. And if Brian Callahan thinks that there is some sort of threat level to his position right now in his first season here, and that he needs to right the ship and put more proof of concept, I guess you could say, and tape on for himself and ownership, I think that's the play here. And that's why you move to Mason Rudolph, especially in 3 games, the 3 divisional games that we've come to know mean just more for this ownership group, whether it is the Jaguars or if it is the Texans or anyone. It just means more for them.
Yeah, and I think you can also look at a couple of things that we've talked about on this show before that's been floating around. Like if owners really are just fans with money, so to speak, then look at how the fans are reacting to this Titans team right now. I can sit here and tell you, wow, the offensive line is looking a lot better than they were at the beginning of the season. I can say, hey, we haven't talked about special teams costing the Titans a game in several weeks. It looks like Tavondre Sweat and Jeffrey Simmons are going to make a hell of a duo along the defensive front. You got Tony Pollard, you got Tyjae Spears making plays. Calvin Ridley's separation numbers have been pretty good, pretty consistent all season long. Jarvis Brownlee Jr. I could go on and on with the positives where this thing is developing, but the narrative is still fire Callahan, fire Carthon, cut Will Levis, all this because of how bad the quarterback position has been. And so if you think ownership is reading it the same way, yeah, you're damn right. You want to get somebody out there that can actually run your offense so that we can all get a glimpse of what it's supposed to look like. Now, I know people, I forget who was in the chat saying, well, it's just boring dink and dunk football from Rudolph. But I got news for you, partner. Dink and dunk, boring ass football probably wins you about 4 more games this season and has the Titans in the hunt for a wild card, maybe even the AFC South title still at this point. I know it's not exciting, but I think there's a reasonable case to be made that poor quarterback play has cost this team at least 4 games. So you want to get a good sample of what your offense can be out there so that we can all see it. And I don't blame him. I don't fault him for making that decision at all, because I do think Mason Rudolph, maybe not the splashiest quarterback out there, but I do think this unit runs more efficiently with him at the helm. And I think that's ultimately going to show more of what this offense is capable of than if you still have Will Levis out there.
Yeah. And I do agree with you, right? That it comes back to what is Mason Rudolph? Mason Rudolph is your conservative play here to limit your turnovers and limit the plays that cost you games. But then again, as Ken says here in the comments, when he says, when Rudolph comes in and wins us 1 or 2 games and costs us a guy like Abdul Carter, and my feelings are going to be hurt so bad. And that's the unfortunate thing, right? That fans, that's the disconnect, right? It's the same thing I was saying all last season when Mike Vrabel and this team were on this losing streak, and they just wanted them to tank and whatnot. It's just, it couldn't be farther out of the coaches and players' minds about who they're going to get in April. And that's the biggest thing here, right? Like, I feel like Callahan's job would probably be in more jeopardy if that's the way he was thinking, right? I feel like we've seen this happen before. Obviously, I feel like the only outlier one, which was very heavily, guided by ownership, was the Lovie Smith one, where he wins the game for the Texans and at the end of the season.
Yeah.
Like, I guess you could push back there when ownership, wants you to lose, I guess. But I don't think that's what ownership has come to expect, or otherwise we wouldn't have seen the drastic changes they've made over the last 2 years. So this is a team that, with these guys in the locker room, you still feel how much they want to win and how much like their jobs are on the line for a lot of them and how much they want to go out there and put success on the board. And so that by playing Rudolph, I think that gives you the best chance for what we said earlier. Just looking at how many points Will Levis costed them in close to 1-score games or very close to 1-score games. Like that is the decision here. And so I think when you look at it like that, you know, I don't know if putting there's no reality, I think, where Will Levis changes anybody's mind now in 3 more games.
Yeah, I would agree.
I don't think there's any way that you could see him. Like, you look at also the games that he did win for this team. I was getting some of that as well. Like, okay, but which quarterback would you pick that is going to win you games? And I would still go with Mason Rudolph, because when was the last time we saw Will Levis be the guy to win a game for this team? Was it the Miami one?
Maybe.
And I feel like maybe people would point towards the Houston Texans game, but I'll remind them that late in that game, Will Levis throws yet another pick 6 and makes that game a 1-score game where you know, the Titans defense stands tall and they force the safety and they get after CJ Stroud in that game. So I wouldn't necessarily also call that one a game that Will Levis, you know, wins. But I think ultimately for me here, this was the choice that Brian Callahan had to make. I think it is the right one for this team and where they are right now. Is it unfortunate that, like I was saying to you before the show, like, could this be a spot where, you know, you're going up against a Indianapolis Colts team that may be just as much of a train wreck or heading towards that as you are right now? You get another game against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Could we be seeing a reality where, you know, Mason Rudolph leads the Tennessee Titans to their first back-to-back wins since the Green Bay game back in 2022, right before the Todd Downing DUI incident? Like, that's a real possibility, I think, for this team. And so it's unfortunate, right? It sucks for draft talk. But once again, we're so far away. So many things can change over the next 3-ish months in terms of draft cycle, that the guys, as much as I do love a guy like Abdul Carter or a guy like Travis Hunter or any of those guys, right? Like, there's still so much time for things to change, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. And to Kenneth's original point there, I would also say I'm a big fan of Abdul Carter. I like his tape a lot, but I don't think it's very prudent of NFL front offices, coaching staffs to like really hitch the wagon to any single player really turning a franchise around, because I think it's actually pretty rare that actually happens. I mean, the draft is still a crapshoot. You never know who's going to work out, who's not going to work out. And it's just completely unwise to say, you know what, let's lose these games and potentially damage the vibes in the locker room because we're going to go get Abdul Carter. Well, then what if Abdul Carter sucks in the NFL? You know, it's not a very prudent move to hitch our hope to, you know, some singular player. I'd love Abdul Carter to be an addition to the Tennessee Titans. I would love Shedeur Sanders to be added to the Tennessee Titans, Luther Burden III. But I think, you know, we can get a little caught up in this idea that the draft is going to save everything sometimes. So that's why I try to encourage people, like, just appreciate the positives that you can in the moment.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that one. And Joey says he's with you as well. Happy that the evaluation is complete and that the Titans have their answer. But the evaluation turned out to be the worst case scenario. We have to be looking for a quarterback in a very bad quarterback class and QB free agency cycle, or perhaps they try once again to tank for the better projected cycle next year. But then who knows what that looks like next year? It's just a whole bunch of, you know, hypotheticals and hoping that ownership still trusts the process. And that's kind of what Eddie said as well. This kind of sucks. We have to wait until 2026 to replace him. But to do that, we need a top 5 pick in 2026. And if that happens, Callie and Rand are cooked. I like the front office, but they won't make it. I would tend to agree with you there. I think that's one of the biggest fears there as well. And Joseph saying he's already seen Mason Rudolph lead Titans offenses and the same mistakes happen. Sure, it might not be catastrophic, but you also can't put lipstick on a pig and tell me it's the prom queen.
Well,
which
listen, Joseph. You get to some of these towns out in rural Tennessee, that pig might just be the prom queen. I'll just say that.
Hey, when you're going up against the Indianapolis Colts and Jacksonville Jaguars, like I think that analogy fits there. But I see where he's coming from, right? Like,
Yeah,
if
yeah.
if you look at what they were able to do against, a team like the Detroit Lions, which that was mainly a special teams issue that made that game kind of get out of hand. People, I think, are quick to forget that the Titans were in it for a little bit. I say in
Looked
it,
good
but like
the first half.
yeah, I mean, it doesn't change the fact that this team is still bad, but they were playing well. You have the game against Buffalo. You have all these games where, Mason Rudolph, kept you in it, but didn't put you so far behind. There were other aspects at play. And since then, I think we've seen a lot of those aspects get marketably better. The special teams has really improved over the past couple of weeks. The offensive line play has improved, even if it is a matter of just like maybe other teams not playing up to their offensive line potential. But like, given the rankings and you look at the statistical categories, the Titans offensive line has continued to improve. Will Levis has seen the least amount of pressure he's seen in quite a while over the last 2 weeks. And so when you look at that, you look at teams that you're going up against here in these last 3 games and saying, what can you take away from it? It shifts the conversation to looking at more of these pieces around the quarterback position and not necessarily at the quarterback position, in my opinion, for this one.
I would also say, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I do think this is a really bad year to be needing a quarterback because, like Eddie pointed out, or forgive me, I can't remember who pointed it out that Eddie agreed with, but the free agency class is kind of Sam Darnold or bust, and the draft class is kind of Shedeur Sanders or bust. Now, I don't think it's hopeless to think that the Titans could end up in a position to select Sanders. I don't know that he's going to be a top 5 pick. I just don't know that the NFL really views this quarterback class at the same level as the fans do right now. I damn sure don't think Cam Ward or Jalen Milroe are first-round picks, and we're still kind of waiting to see if Milroe's actually going to declare for the draft or if he's going to go back to Alabama for another year. But I can say, like, from a team-building standpoint, I can't imagine that this regime is going to go into the draft and just say, you know what, we're just going to reset. We're going to tank. We're going to be awful this year, and we're going to regroup for the 2026 draft. The bottom line is, if you need a guy, you've got to go get a guy. So they're going to leave no stone unturned. They're going to go out there. They're going to do their diligence. Brother, I'm lining up tape on Dylan Gabriel, on Max Brosmer, on Kyle McCord. Like, we're gonna study these quarterbacks, and we're gonna find somebody that we might could give a shot to. And I'm not saying that that's okay, but I'm just saying the reality is they've got to have a quarterback somewhere. This is not a situation where you sit back and you say, well, we'll wait till 2026.
Yeah, I think it's a long ways away still.
Yeah,
and that's where Titans fans are still pretty frustrated. But I think that we can get there by way of our wonderful and amazing sponsors, Sinkers Beverages and Bluegrass Beverages. You like that one there? I was trying to think of the best way to do it. But Sinkers Beverages has been serving the East Nashville area for over 40 years. They are a 4-time Best of Nashville Liquor Store of the Year, including this year, 2024. Got to get out there because they won for good reason, because they simply have the best selection of beer, wine, and spirits in the city. And when you go over there, you got to make sure that you sign up for their in-crowd to get special benefits, allocations, and bi-weekly tastings that you can only know about when you sign up for their in-crowd. Also follow them on social media at SinkersBev on Twitter and sinkers.nashville on Instagram. If you can't make it out there and you want the booze delivered to you, don't worry, they've got you covered. Simply search Sinkers on Uber Eats, and they will deliver the booze to you because they drive so you can drink responsibly. Have to give a shout out to Bluegrass Beverages once again as well, who have been serving the Hendersonville area for over 50 years. Thank you to Sinkers Beverages and Bluegrass Beverages for sponsoring the show. Stoney, you talk a little bit about some of the future. And I think that's where I want to take the conversation next with a little bit of the time that we have with it here that we have left in the show. But before we get to that, a couple more questions. Kind of along the lines that you were just talking. M says, do you think the organization forces drafting a quarterback in the draft, or will they give Callahan another year to draft a quarterback next year? I see. Here's the thing, right? With the amount of picks that they have, and we'll talk about picks here in a second because there's been a little bit of talk about that. Like, you have enough 4th or 5th round picks where maybe guys like Kyle McCord or some of these guys who aren't at the top tier with literally just Shedeur Sanders, like that, you might as well take a flyer on one of them that maybe
Sure.
Brian Callahan likes. And so I think that's now with that, do they force them to use one of those picks? I think that's a real different situation than what we thought with the Will Levis situation, kind of forcing them to move up in the 2nd round. I think it's a lot different. The blow is lessened a lot. And if it were to work out, that would, that's where you kind of strike gold, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's a tough spot to be in if you are being forced to draft. I mean, any position really, but the quarterback, they need someone, but there have been a couple of interesting nuggets come out recently that, well, in recent years, I should say, not like yesterday, but a couple of nuggets that I would point to as to potential indicators as to how they'll approach this situation. For one, I think Rand Carthon's philosophy as a general manager is very much roll the dice, play the board. I think it will be a situation where they still have to get value, right? We heard rumors on draft night in 2023 that if Peter Skoronski wasn't available, that Will Levis would have been the pick there, but they didn't count on Peter Skoronski being available. They thought Chicago was going to take him. They go with Darnell Wright instead, and then suddenly the best offensive lineman in the draft class is right there, and they didn't feel like they could pass him up. It's a little bit of flexibility there. The second thing I would point to is the signing of Calvin Ridley and how they talked about a couple of signings didn't go their way, and suddenly they had a little bit of extra money that they had allocated elsewhere that they're like, hey, we can put this together and make this guy an offer. And then they went out and they got him. They sealed the deal. So I think the flexibility, the ability to pivot is going to be a crucial principle throughout this quarterback process. I think if they end up with the 12th pick and Shedeur Sanders is still there, great. If he's gone, I don't expect them to reach on a guy. They're going to find a veteran, maybe even bring back Mason Rudolph for another year. There's the darkest timeline that everybody's going to be. I'm going to have people with pitchforks out in front of my house if that happens, but they're going to have an option prepared. They're going to be able to pivot. I think that is something that has been, not every signing, not every drafting has been a hit, but I think that they have benefited from having that flexibility. And I would expect them to have that with the quarterback position as well, whether it is spending a 1st round pick or, like you said, like taking a flyer in the middle rounds on one of these guys, like McCord or Brosmer or Gabriel, or somebody. Eddie asked about Jackson Dart. I think Jackson Dart has plenty of good tape out there too. So like I think it's going to be a similar approach to what we've seen them do so far and how they've attacked various positions. They're going to have an ideal, but they're going to be willing to pivot.
Yeah. And I think the next thing before we move on is this kind of sentiment that Kenneth is saying here. He truly feels in his gut that this is an Amy Adams Strunk decision, basically saying, show me you and your staff are worth keeping. Joseph also kind of believes along the same line of thinking there. These last 3 games are Brian Callahan's time to show his proof of concept without the scapegoat of awful quarterback play. If it looks average or even, dare I say, good, wonderful. If not, it will be DEFCON 3. And I would say that I think I would agree with you at most points with that, but also like you said earlier, we've seen a lot of the good that Brian Callahan has been able to do. I mean, you look at what they've been able to do in scoring this year. I mean, they've compared to the last 2 Vrabel years, they've scored more passing touchdowns and average more points per game than that Mike Vrabel did in his last 2 years. It's not by much, but it is more than the last 2 years. of scoring. So like we've already seen him have the capability. Also, putting up 30 points twice in a season where you hadn't done it in literally 1,000 days before Brian Callahan was here. I don't know if that's something that really means a lot, but I think that also is worth mentioning there. I don't know, Stoney. I know we talked about how you think that there is already good tape out there, but is there maybe a sentiment or two that you might be feeling that this is a kind of a nut up and shut up moment for Brian Callahan and show us what you have as a head coach and play caller together?
I don't necessarily think that we're there just yet, because it was communicated to us back in February before all of these signings and everything kind of got the fan base a little riled up, thinking they were going to be a little more competitive, myself included, than they actually ended up being. We're kind of talking about, like Chad Brinker saying on the Official Titans podcast, like looking at it from like a 3-year lens, like this is going to be a big rebuild. And we've heard Brian Callahan talk about how he talks to Amy Adams-Strunk every Monday, which we know was kind of a big point of contention between the last regime. And damn it, we almost made it a full episode without hearing Mike Vrabel's name. But we know that they weren't really talking anymore, and that was kind of a tough spot for the relationship. Well, you think, okay, if they're communicating about this in terms of a multi-year rebuild, which the roster in hindsight now looking back absolutely is like has potential to be 3 years away from being really good again. But if that expectation is set and those conversations are had in February, and then he's remaining in contact with her throughout the week, every Monday, I would hope that patience has been the message, understanding has been the message, and ultimately that will prevail. I also say, I don't think anything's off the table with this ownership group, because I think, as much as I think in hindsight now it was the right move, I think it was justifiable, at least, that you could have given Mike Vrabel another year to try and right the ship. I think you could have probably given John Robinson one more player acquisition cycle drink to get things right. I think you can go back to Mike Mularkey and say it was definitely justifiable to keep him on board and give him a chance. And they were all fired before I think it was really expected for them to be fired. And that is the ultimate wild card for me, where I'm just like, I don't know, man. I don't know what she's going to do. I think if the expectations were set, she would err on the side of patience. But I don't know that for sure. So I don't think that it is a situation where it's like, you've got to win these 3 games or else you're fired. But you never say never in this business, I guess.
Yeah, because what Kenneth says, and Kenneth, longtime listener of the Hot Read podcast, has been on this train. He says last year when the Vrabel fire train was building, he was saying don't underestimate emotional ownership decision. He says he hopes sanity prevails here and Callahan stays. But once again, like you said, it could be, the off chance that this really is, the time for Brian Callahan to prove it. I would hate that as well. But, it could be possible, I think. And that's once again, going back to what we said at the beginning, like we still don't know exactly like what the talks are, right? Like we don't know how that relationship is. And that's by way of many different things from a lot of different parties. And so that's the unfortunate thing. All right. Last thing we'll get to here before we sign off. And we can use Ed's comment here as kind of a segue. He says, considering the rebuild track, and that where they are on it right now, it would appear Jeffrey Simmons would be past his prime when they are ready to win. Do they consider moving him for assets? I think his name popped up a lot at the trade deadline. I think it's very plausible that he could be on the move. But when talking about a guy like Jeffrey Simmons, I think it's also, I think you can also have it be fair to say that Will Levis could also potentially be on the move, the way we've seen trades for quarterbacks, young quarterbacks, might I add, like over the past 24 months or so happen. And so before I talk about Will Levis trade, do you have any thoughts on Jeffrey Simmons whatsoever?
I kind of feel like if they were going to move Simmons, they would have done it at the trade deadline. But I don't know, JT. You're around the coaches, around the players, and I'm obviously not. I just sit in my house all day. But you probably have a better read on it. I kind of feel like this coaching staff adores Jeffrey Simmons, and they kind of view him as integral, the sort of backbone of this defense. I don't really feel like they want to necessarily move on from Jeffrey Simmons, because they probably had opportunities to do so at this trade deadline, and they didn't get what they thought he was worth. So I kind of feel like he's a guy that you're going to have to give up a king's ransom to pry him away from this team. And I don't know that anybody's going to do it. I kind of feel like they want him to stay and be the leader, for better or for worse.
Yeah, and that's what we've talked about all season, right? He is the de facto leader now of this team. We talk to him every time after after a game in the locker room at Nissan Stadium. He's always the last guy we talk to. He's the last guy out, so to say, or and he kind of gives the State of Union address. And some of those have been states of frustration over the past couple of weeks. But I do agree with you that this is, you don't start building this culture under Brian Callahan just to get rid of the guy that you would deem the leader a year later. And so that's why I said, when you have those talks, never say never. But I feel like I think I agree with you that he would have been the guy to ship at the deadline if you were going to do it then. Which leaves us with Will Levis and the talk about, this other idea that, hey, with Will Levis, like, you totally should play him to kind of see if he can get out of this rut, build up his stock, and then be able to ship him off. And by benching him here, you're losing value on Will Levis, because obviously we heard from Brian Callahan, who, never say never on anything, kind of left the door open where he says, those are questions for after the season when we get a chance to sit down and really look at the totality of work and where we stand. But with everything, it still feels like it is over for him. But I wanted to go back and look at, the different trades that happened at least last year between like Kenny Pickett, Sam Howell, and Desmond Ridder. All three guys that were effectively benched at the end of last season. The only guy which you could say maybe wasn't an outright benching, but Kenny Pickett does go down with injury, has to miss 2 games. But instead of going back to their starter, they ride the hot-handed Mason Rudolph into the playoffs there. And so, he was effectively benched at the end of 2023. And that, I would say, is one of the biggest ones. So you look at Kenny Pickett, who was effectively benched. The Eagles acquired him and a 2024 4th-round pick in exchange for a 3rd-round pick and a pair of 7th. So you got three picks for Kenny Pickett, which,
man, that's wild.
That's kind of 3 picks where you increase one of those, where you move up into the 3rd there. You look at Sam Howell, where last year he was benched for Jacoby Brissett late into the season. Howell this year was traded. He went to Seattle. Howell and a 6th-rounder went to Seattle in exchange for a 3rd-round pick and a 5th-round pick. So that is, once again, another that's another option there that you could look at. And then, of course, Desmond Ridder was benched for Taylor Heineke, and he's traded 1-for-1 for Rondale Moore, which is a wide receiver 3 to 4-ish. And so what are the Titans, if healthy, right? So what are the Titans options going forward? Like, if there was a reality where Will Levis is dealt this offseason, like I just said, the Titans do have a pretty bounty of 4th and 5th-round picks. I could see it totally plausible that, with them not having a 3rd-round pick this year, if they truly are done with Will Levis, done, you see Will Levis in a 4th or Will Levis in a 5th go for a 3rd and maybe a 6th or something like that. If we're going up against what Kenny Pickett and Sam Howell went for, I feel like you could probably find similar value for a guy like Will Levis. And so, I don't think, looking at these guys who were effectively benched at the end of last season and looking at Will Levis, who is now benched as well, I don't see that as a hindrance to what you can get for a young quarterback like that. It's all about just finding the right suitor.
Yeah. And for people, okay, I don't want to forget this point. What if you play Will Levis and then he gets hurt? Because we have seen him be pretty prone to injury. Yeah. Then what's his trade value? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's, something to consider as well. Also, you could say, well, you guys are talking about how awful he's been. Why would anybody trade for him? Why would the Titans draft him to begin with? Because he had the traits, he had the tools, and they thought we could develop him. We could turn him into something. there are probably, I'm going to be willing to bet there are probably 31 other head coaches in the NFL that think if I got that guy to camp, I could develop him into something. That's how teams make bad decisions all the time. They fall in love with a player, the traits, the talent, the athleticism, and they say, hey, you know what? We can fix him. So I think there absolutely is a quarterback needy team, even if it's not a quarterback needy team. Somebody like the Los Angeles Rams, we've mentioned their name before. Aging veteran Matthew Stafford. I don't even know who their backup is right now. I know they drafted Stetson
Jimmy Garoppolo
a year or two ago. Jimmy G still kicking in the NFL.
Yeah.
How about that? But a team like that could say, hey, we can bring you in and sit you for a few years or a couple of years and see what you got down the line. Yeah, you don't think it's worth it for them to potentially find a guy that they could hand the reins over to for like a 4th, 5th round pick? Like, absolutely somebody would do it. So I like the idea if they can find a dance partner. I think that's how you acquire more picks. And we know that this front office wants more picks.
Yeah, Eddie saying, ship him to the Rams, get Stafford back. I don't know. He's just spitballing. There you go. That's how deals are made right there.
Will Levis, what would you have to do to get Stafford? Will Levis and a second?
And like a 26 second?
Yeah, something like that.
They're not going to, I mean, he just restructured his contract. I don't think they're going to do that for less than face value of a guy like Will Levis, especially if you don't have any other option there. And then we'll end on here. Cloudhouse saying, would you agree that the quarterback the Titans developed most this past offseason was Willis? Now, I feel like, yeah, no, that would probably have been this regime type thing, right?
I think so. I mean, shit, look at the leaps he took this preseason. And then, just from like a comfort standpoint, it did kind of feel like Malik Willis was the one out of all these quarterbacks that really took a step forward under Brian Callahan. And we didn't really get to see that, obviously, how it would have translated to meaningful NFL action. I'm glad you brought that comment up, because I was actually going to make a joke about the Titans trading for Malik Willis, but now I don't have to. There we go.
There you go. And you know what? It all won't matter when we get Drew Aller to change his mind. And so,
That's right. That's right.
Kenneth says he would like in a future episode to know what you would do if you were in charge of this offseason. That sounds fun. And I'm sure we're going to have a lot of time, because they are not going to be playing January football for very long this season.
No, so I don't think so.
We definitely will be able to do that and so much more. But that's going to do it for today's episode. One more thing.
One more thing.
Got it. You got it. 2 more. Oh, okay.
Call Arizona, snipe Clayton Tune off the practice squad. I don't even know if he's still on the practice squad, but he was at one point.
I think he came into the game on Sunday.
Okay, so he is still an Arizona Cardinal. Call the Arizona Cardinals about Clayton Tune. And how about the possibility over these last 3 games we finally get to see the Colton Dowell era in Tennessee?
Hey, how about that? That would certainly be interesting because, when we thought about Colton Dowell earlier in the season, we're like, man, where is his role? Well, now the Titans simply just don't have any receivers. So like, it feels like there's room once again for him.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's going to do it for our episode today. Thank you to our sponsors, Sinkers and Bluegrass Beverages, for sponsoring the show as always. And a little programming note, I guess we can say that Friday's show will go on as normal, but it will be, at least on the live versions of it, will be pre-recorded. So throw whatever you want in that chat, I guess. I won't be able to see it, maybe I'll be lurking and seeing what you guys truly think of me and Stoney.
If I'm available, I will be in the chat, because I'm going to be in a car all day on Friday.
Wonderful.
And I'm gonna try and hop into the chat if I can, but I can't commit to that. I'm taking a couple of weeks off, man. The end of this year has been nuts.
Yeah.
I want to prop my feet up and rest for a little bit before we really get into draft season.
That is right. And so we will be back with an episode talking about the Titans maybe being big brain, playing a guy named Rudolph on Christmas week. I don't know. Maybe that we didn't even think about that, but that could be the ticket here as we get into the later weeks of December, having a guy named Rudolph taking you to the promised land, which is maybe like the 9th or 10th pick. But nonetheless, this has been the Hot Read Podcast. Until Friday, we will talk to you then.